No one at Tidewater Animal Rescue dared step into Isolation Ward 7 anymore. The scarred Belgian Malinois had snapped 2 control poles, bitten through a plastic barrier, and sent 3 staff members to the emergency room, all within 4 days. The euthanasia order had been signed, the syringe was prepared, and when the veterinarian finally moved toward the kennel door, everyone in the hallway went still. Then a man in a worn navy jacket pushed through the entrance and stepped in front of a set of bared teeth. He didn't flinch. He looked the dog in the eye and spoke one word: "Anchor." The dog dropped to the floor and began to shake as though it had just found the one person it had never stopped waiting for. If you're new here, stories like this one are what this channel is built for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's go back to the beginning. The call that started everything came from a broken-down shipyard on the southern bank of the Elizabeth River, a place that by all reasonable measures should have had nothing left to offer anyone. Ray Morrow had worked animal control in Chesapeake for its coat matted with grime and dried blood, one ear torn in a way that had clearly never been treated. Around its neck, tangled in the fur at the base of the throat, was a length of black tactical cord that had been cut rather than unbuckled. Ray noticed that detail and didn't know what to do with it, so he filed it away and focused on the situation in front of him. The dog didn't run when the 3 of them entered the room. That alone was unusual. Most strays in a cornered space either bolted or collapsed in submission. This one did neither. It positioned itself in front of a far corner, lowered its center of gravity, and tracked every one of their movements with a steadiness that felt less like fear and more like calculation. When one of Ray's colleagues stepped past an invisible line roughly 6 feet from the animal, it attacked, not in a frantic, lunging way, but with a precision that made Ray's stomach drop. It went straight for the forearm holding the control pole, connected, released, and returned to its original position in under 3 seconds. It took 4 hours and a tranquilizer administered at distance before they were able to load the dog into the transport. In that time, it snapped through 2 control poles that weren't designed to break. Ray rode in the back on the way to the shelter. He kept watching the animal's face as it slipped under that same flat, assessing expression, holding on longer than it should have before the sedative finally won. They logged it as a stray and placed it in Isolation Ward 7. By the end of the first day, the dog had refused every meal, dismantled the water bowl, and responded to no commands from any of the staff. It tolerated no one inside its established boundary. By the second day, it had bitten through a plastic barrier rated for dogs twice its size, sending 2 staff members to the emergency room for stitching. By the 4th morning, a 3rd incident had occurred, less severe physically, but bad enough that the employee involved submitted a formal report and asked to be reassigned away from that corridor. The staff started calling it Ripper because that was what it felt like, something that had come apart at the seams and taken everything near it along for the ride. Dr. Felix Brennan, the shelter's attending veterinarian, didn't use that name. He had been watching the dog since the first afternoon, and what he saw didn't match the nickname. He kept a running log of its behavior, not for any official purpose, but because the patterns bothered him in a way he couldn't let go. The dog patrolled the same route inside its kennel every 2 hours, precisely. It attacked equipment, never faces. It aimed for wrists and forearms, the limbs that held tools, and released before causing maximum damage. After each incident, it returned to the same corner and resumed its watch. There was nothing random about any of it. On his second examination attempt, Felix had managed to get close enough to the bars to note a curved scar on the dog's chest, pale and smooth, shaped like a quarter moon, the kind of mark left by something sharp and fast rather than blunt trauma. He wrote it down in his log without being able to explain its significance yet. It sat alongside everything else he was collecting: the patrol route, the targeting patterns, the way the dog seemed to make deliberate decisions rather than reactive ones. Felix brought his notes to Wea Sutter at the end of day 3, spreading the pages across her desk and walking her through the pattern without editorializing. Leah was the shelter director, mid-40s, practical, the kind of person who kept a clear head under pressure because she had trained herself to. She listened to everything Felix said, asked 2 or 3 questions, and then sat back and looked out the window for a long moment. She told him she believed him, and that it didn't change what they were facing. The facility was already over capacity. They couldn't dedicate resources indefinitely to a single animal that had injured multiple staff members and shown no signs of stabilizing. Ray was standing in the doorway during this conversation. When Leah finished, he said that he agreed with her. He had watched that dog snap through 2 aluminum control poles, and the memory hadn't left him. Whatever was going on inside the animal's head, the result was the same. Someone was going to get seriously hurt. Felix didn't argue. He returned to his office, opened the case file, and added one final note at the bottom of his behavioral log. Not aggression, executing a protocol. Then he closed the folder and went to prepare his equipment for the following day. Leah signed the euthanasia authorization that evening. The procedure was scheduled for 5 o'clock the following afternoon. That night, she walked past Ward 7 on her way out of the building. The dog was in its corner, the kennel dim and quiet. It heard her footsteps and turned its head to look at her through the bars. Not with hostility and not with pleading. It looked at her the way a soldier on watch might look at a civilian passing by, noting the presence, assessing the threat level, returning to its task. She stood there for a moment, then kept walking. Duncan Reeves was 39 years old and living in a rented house near the water in Virginia Beach. A 2-bedroom place he had chosen because it was close to the ocean and because no one he knew lived nearby. He had separated from the Navy 3 years earlier, following a mission that had gone wrong in the final minutes. And the separation had not been clean. He had lost a significant portion of the hearing in his right ear. Of a cargo vessel had separated them during extraction. Duncan had been thrown into a steel bulkhead by the force of the blast. By the time he regained consciousness in a naval hospital, the search for Mako had already been called off. The Navy's conclusion was that the dog had been lost overboard when the ship listed. No body, no collar, no tracking signal had been recovered. Duncan had accepted the paperwork and never accepted the conclusion. For 3 years he had tracked missing military working dog reports, monitored private security company rosters, followed threads through maritime shipping records and port authority logs. He found nothing that led anywhere. The searches gradually became less frequent, but he never fully stopped. He kept Mako's old leash in the breast pocket of his jacket, a worn length of black nylon that he had no logical reason to carry and couldn't bring himself to put down. The call from Nate Calder came at roughly 2:30 in the afternoon, on the same day Leah had scheduled the euthanasia. Nate had been in Duncan's unit and still kept loose tabs on his old teammates. He had seen a post on Tidewater Animal Rescue's public social media page, a photo of a dog in isolation that someone had captioned with a warning about a dangerous animal. Nate had almost scrolled past it. Then something about the dog's build, the angle of its ears, the way it was positioning its body against the fence made him stop. He sent the image to Duncan without writing anything, just the photo. Duncan looked at it on his phone screen and felt the ground shift under him. The dog in the image was filthy, underweight, and snarling into a chain-link fence. In any other context, it could have been any large Malinois. But Duncan's eyes went immediately to the lower left canine tooth, where a small metallic crown caught the light at the edge of the dog's open mouth. Mako had cracked that tooth during a vessel boarding 3 years before the mission that ended everything. The repair had been done at a naval veterinary facility using a titanium cap. And on the dog's chest, visible through the matted fur, was that curved scar shaped like a quarter moon. The mark from a piece of shrapnel that Mako had taken during a cargo hold sweep in the Red Sea. Duncan called Tidewater immediately. The staff member who answered told them they couldn't share information about animals in their care without documentation establishing ownership, and that the dog in question was not available for adoption due to its behavioral history. When Duncan pressed, the call was transferred to a voicemail box. He called back twice more and was told the same thing by different voices. When he finally asked directly whether the dog was scheduled for euthanasia, the line went quiet before the staff member said that decisions about individual animals were made through their internal review process, and she wasn't able to discuss specifics. He spent another 20 minutes attempting to reach his supervisor, then a county animal services liaison, then a General Navy administrative line that put him on hold before disconnecting. By the time he accepted that no phone call was going to resolve this, it was nearly 3:15. He already had his keys in his hand. The drive from Virginia Beach to Chesapeake took just under 40 minutes under normal conditions. Halfway there, she was still standing there when the door at the end of the corridor opened, and a man she had never seen walked in at a pace that told her immediately he had not come to surrender. He was broad-shouldered and unshaven, wearing a faded navy jacket over a gray shirt, and he moved with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested he had experience in situations where moving too fast could make things worse. He told her his name was Duncan Reeves. He told her the dog in Ward 7 was Mako, a military working dog from a naval special warfare unit, and that he was the dog's assigned handler. He told her she needed to stop the procedure. Leah heard him out without interrupting. Then she told him as clearly as she could that she could not halt an authorized euthanasia order based on a verbal claim from someone who had arrived 18 minutes before the scheduled time, with no documentation, no proof of ownership, and no prior contact with the facility. She was not trying to be unkind. She was trying to be responsible for the people who worked in the building. Duncan described the titanium crown on the lower left canine, a repair made at a naval veterinary clinic after a tooth fracture during a maritime boarding. He described a curved scar on the dog's chest, shaped like a quarter moon, from a shrapnel wound sustained in the Red Sea. He described a patch of skin behind the right rear leg where fur had never grown back after a burn injury during training. He delivered each detail without hesitation in the flat, sequential way of someone reciting coordinates rather than making a case. Felix was listening from the doorway of the adjacent room. He had documented that scar in his intake notes. He had written down the fur anomaly on the rear leg and assumed it was an old wound with no further significance. He looked down at the folder in his hands and said nothing, but he didn't move away either. Leah told Duncan he believed what he was saying. That wasn't sufficient. The dog had no readable microchip, no tags, no verifiable records, and had injured 3 of her staff. She had a legal and ethical obligation to follow the process that had already been approved. If he wanted to establish a claim, she would give him the number for the County Animal Services Office, and he could begin the paperwork there. From somewhere behind the closed door of Ward 7, the dog made a sound. A single, sharp bark, low and clipped. Nothing like the frantic noise it had been producing all week. Duncan's head turned toward it. Something in his face changed, though it wasn't easy to describe exactly how. He took 2 steps toward the ward door, and Ray Morrow moved to intercept him, positioning himself in the gap between Duncan and the corridor. Ray was not a small man, and he had spent 19 years handling animals that didn't want to be handled. He told Duncan in a voice that carried no hostility, but no flexibility either, that he could not go back there. Duncan looked at him steadily for a moment, then used a movement that was fast enough and technical enough that Ray found himself off balance against the wall before he fully registered what had happened. Duncan was already moving down the corridor. Leah called after him. Felix jogged to keep up. Ray pushed himself off the wall and followed, half expecting to hear the sound of the kennel door being torn apart from the inside. Felix had his tranquilizer equipment in hand when Duncan reached the front of Ward 7. The plan had been to administer sedation through the kennel bars before the procedure, a safer option than direct entry given the dog's history. He hadn't fired yet. He had been waiting for the room to clear. Mako had already registered the movement in the hallway. By the time Duncan stopped in front of the kennel, the dog was at the bars, both forepaws pressed against the lower rail, teeth showing a sound building in its chest that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a warning. It hit the fence once, hard, and the entire frame shuddered. Leah grabbed Felix's arm and told him to take the shot. Felix raised the equipment and lined up the angle. Duncan stepped directly in front of the kennel door. Leah told him to move. Ray said the dog could push its jaws through the gap between the bars at close range. Duncan reached up and unclipped the small metal whistle he wore on a cord around his neck. The training whistle, the one he had carried for 3 years without being able to explain why, and held it in his closed fist. Then he lowered himself to one knee on the concrete floor and spread both hands open where the dog could see them clearly. Mako launched itself at the fence again. The impact was loud enough to bring 2 staff members to the hallway entrance. The dog's teeth were inches from Duncan's face. Duncan looked into its eyes and said one word: "Anchor." The dog froze. It wasn't a flinch, and it wasn't a retreat. It was a full stop, the way a machine stops when its power is cut. The growl died in its throat. Its ears, which had been flat against its skull, lifted slowly, and then trembled at the tips. The expression in its eyes shifted. The hard, targeted focus broke apart into something more fractured, more confused. And underneath the confusion, something that looked almost like recognition, fighting its way to the surface. Duncan held the position. He didn't reach forward. He didn't speak again immediately. He simply waited, on one knee, on the concrete, hands open, and let the silence hold what words couldn't carry. Then he said it again, quieter this time, barely above a whisper. "Anchor." Mako stepped back from the bars. Its hindquarters dropped first, then its chest lowered until it was lying flat on the kennel floor, in a precise downstay, chin resting on both forepaws, weight settled, body still. Its eyes never left Duncan's face. After several seconds, it made a sound that no one in the building had heard it make before. A low, broken whine, barely audible, like a frequency too long suppressed, finally finding its way out. Nobody in the hallway moved. Felix lowered the tranquilizer gun to his side. Ray stood with one hand still raised from when he had started to call out a warning, and he lowered it slowly, the way you lower something you forgot you were holding. Leah watched the dog on the kennel floor and felt the understanding arrive in pieces. Not a single moment of clarity, but a series of small realizations that assembled themselves into something she couldn't look away from. Duncan pushed his hand through the gap in the kennel bars. Mako crawled forward on its belly and pressed its nose against his fingers. Then it began to shake, not the frantic shaking of a frightened animal, but a deep, full-body trembling, as though every muscle that had been locked in tension for longer than anyone in that hallway could account for was releasing all at once. Ray took a step backward without deciding to. He looked at the man kneeling on the floor and the dog trembling on the other side of the bars, and something in the architecture of his certainty about the past 4 days quietly came apart. The kennel door stayed locked. Leah made that clear, and Duncan didn't argue. Mako was calm, but calm was not the same as verified, and verified was not the same as authorized. She told him what she needed confirmation, that the dog was a registered military working animal, and documentation establishing his legal right to take custody. She wasn't moving on those requirements. She also told Felix to stand down on the procedure until further notice. That much she could do. Duncan asked her to contact the Naval Support Activity Base in Virginia Beach and request the officer of record for working dog assignments. He told her the microchip in the dog would not read on a commercial scanner. The chips used in special operations units were encrypted to prevent identification if an animal was captured. She would need military scanning equipment to pull the data. Leah wrote the information down and went to make calls. Felix stayed. He sat on a folding chair outside the kennel and watched the dog, which had not moved from the spot directly behind the bars nearest to Duncan. Duncan sat on the floor, his back against the wall, the old leash coiled in his hands. He hadn't put it away. He was turning it slowly between his fingers, the way some people handle worry beads. Not consciously, just as something for the hands to do, while the rest of him waited. He noticed when a supply cart rolled past the end of the hallway and its metal wheels rang against the doorframe. Mako was on its feet before the sound finished, body angled toward Duncan, positioning itself between him and the direction of the noise. Duncan said its name quietly. Just the name, nothing else. And the dog held its ground for another moment before lowering itself back down, eyes still tracking the empty hallway. Felix observed this without commenting. He had written in his notes 4 days ago that the dog appeared to be executing a protocol rather than acting out of uncontrolled aggression. He was watching the protocol in action now. The animal wasn't guarding the kennel. It was guarding the person on the other side of the bars. Duncan took the leash from his hands and set it on the floor, where Mako could see it through the gap in the bars. The dog stretched its neck forward and sniffed it. Then its tail, which had not moved since the animal arrived at the shelter, tapped the concrete floor twice, in slow, uncertain strokes. Like a reflex, it had almost forgotten how to complete. Ray was standing at the far end of the hallway watching. He didn't come closer. He sat down against the wall right where he stood, and after a moment, he looked away from the kennel entirely, giving the space to the two of them. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because something about the scene made it feel like the right thing to do. Elise Ward arrived 40 minutes later with a military technician and a scanning unit that was larger and more industrial-looking than anything Tidewater's staff had seen used on an animal before. She was a naval liaison officer, direct and unhurried, and she had clearly been briefed enough on the situation to skip the explanatory portion of the conversation. The technician ran the scanner over Mako's left shoulder while Duncan kept a hand flat against the kennel bars. The dog allowed it. The device took 11 seconds to process the chip. When the screen populated, Elise read the output aloud in a level voice without inflection, as though she were reading coordinates. Name, unit, classification, and handler of record.
Mako, Special Operations Military Working Dog. Handler, Duncan Reeves.
Leah was standing 3 feet away. She read the screen herself, then looked at the man sitting on the floor of her hallway for a long moment before she turned and told her staff to get the kennel key. The door opened slowly. Mako didn't rush it. It stood at the threshold for a moment, reading the space beyond the bars, with the same careful attention it had given every room it had ever entered. Then it walked out, past every person in the hallway without acknowledging them, and pressed the full length of its body against Duncan's legs. Duncan went down to one knee. He put both arms around the dog and held on his face turned away from the hallway, and nobody present found any reason to speak. Then Mako's rear legs buckled. It happened without warning. One moment the dog was solid and present, and the next, its hindquarters were sliding sideways, its breathing suddenly labored and rapid. Duncan caught it before it hit the floor. There was blood on his hand when he pulled it back, coming from somewhere low on the dog's abdomen, where the matted fur had concealed a wound that had been concealed for a long time. Felix was already moving. He crouched beside the dog, got a hand under its flank, and told Duncan in a measured voice that they needed to transport immediately. There was an emergency veterinary center 12 minutes away. He did not say what he thought the blood meant, but the way his jaw set when he pressed gently on the dog's side said enough. Duncan gathered Mako into his arms and stood. The dog made no sound. Its eyes were open, fixed on Duncan's face, and it did not look away. The Atlantic Veterinary Center was 12 minutes from Tidewater, and Duncan drove it in 9, with Felix in the passenger seat directing him through 2 red lights. Mako lay across the back seat with its head in Elise's lap, breathing in shallow pulls that were too fast and too shallow, and getting worse. Duncan didn't look in the rearview mirror. He kept his eyes on the road and both hands on the wheel, and said nothing the entire way. The surgical team met them at the bay door. Felix had called ahead, and the attending surgeon, a compact, efficient woman who introduced herself only by her last name, Holt, had already reviewed the preliminary information. They moved Mako onto a gurney with the practiced speed of people who had done emergency intake many times, and the dog went with it without resistance, its eyes tracking Duncan until the doors swung shut between them. Duncan stood in the corridor outside the surgical suite and did not sit down for a long time. Felix came to find him after speaking with Dr. Holt's team. He explained what the imaging had shown: a metal fragment lodged near a primary abdominal artery surrounded by infection that had been spreading silently for months. Mako's heart was under strain. Its liver values were poor from prolonged malnutrition. The infection alone would have been serious, combined with the cardiovascular stress of the past 4 days of sustained threat response. It had pushed the dog's body to a threshold it could not maintain. There were 2 options, Felix told him. The first was comfort, management, pain relief, hydration, no surgical intervention. It would keep Mako stable for a few hours, possibly through the night. The second was emergency surgery to remove the fragment and address the infection directly. The procedure carried significant risk given the dog's current condition. Dr. Holt had estimated the probability of surviving the operation at somewhere between 40 and 60%. And she had told Felix that estimate was optimistic. Duncan listened to all of it without interrupting. When Felix finished, he asked how long he had before he needed to decide. Felix said they wanted an answer within the next 20 minutes. Mako's blood pressure was dropping, and the window for viable surgical intervention would not stay open indefinitely. Duncan asked to see the dog. They led him into the pre-op room, where Mako was lying on a padded table under a warming blanket, an IV line in its foreleg, and a monitor tracking its heart rate in soft, unsteady peaks. The dog heard him come in before it saw him. Its tail moved once against the table, a single, slow sweep, and its eyes opened and found his face with the same directness they had always carried, even now, even reduced to this. Duncan pulled a stool to the side of the table and sat close enough that Mako didn't have to lift its head to see him. He put one hand against the side of the dog's neck, just resting there, and for a while, he didn't speak. He thought about a ship listing in the dark off the Horn of Africa, and a blast that had taken the floor out from under him before he had any chance to react. He thought about waking up in a hospital and being told to begin the process of acceptance. He thought about 3 years of looking without finding, and the particular quality of guilt that comes not from doing something wrong, but from surviving something that took someone else. He leaned forward and said very quietly, "Anchor." Mako lifted its right forepaw and placed it on Duncan's wrist. It was a gesture from their working years, something the dog had done before every difficult deployment in the staging area or the hold of a transport helicopter, when both of them were waiting on something they couldn't control. Duncan had never taught it. It had simply appeared one day and become part of the language between them. He had not seen it in 3 years and had assumed, in the way that you assume things you don't want to examine too closely, that he would not see it again. He told Felix they were doing the surgery. Elise Ward found him in the waiting area an hour into the operation and sat down 2 seats away from him. She had a folder in her hands that she set on the empty chair between them without opening it immediately. She said she had been making calls while he was with Mako and that there were things he should know about the past 3 years. She didn't read from the folder. She told it the way you tell something you've been turning over in your mind long enough that the words have already been arranged. After the explosion on the cargo vessel, Mako had not gone overboard. The dog had been trapped in a forward cargo hold when the ship listed, sealed in when a bulkhead door jammed in the chaos of the blast and the subsequent flooding response. The Navy's search had concentrated on the water and the upper decks. No one had checked the hold, because no one had known anyone was in it. A private maritime salvage crew working the vessel 2 days after the incident had found the dog alive. Given the nature of the operation and the value of a trained special operations animal, they had made a business decision rather than a humanitarian one. Mako had passed through 3 private security contractors over the following 18 months. Each of them had attempted to integrate the dog into their operations. Each of them had failed. Mako did not accept new handlers. It followed basic commands when it chose to and refused the rest. It found exits and tested them. It did not attack the contractor's personnel outright. It simply made itself ungovernable in ways that were costly and unpredictable, and that none of their trainers could correct. Because the problem wasn't training. The problem was that the dog was waiting for someone who wasn't there. Eventually, it had been acquired by a company called Stonewake Maritime Security, which had decided that an animal of its caliber was worth more on the open market as a high-end protection asset than as an operational liability. While Stonewake was arranging the sale, a federal investigation into their contracting practices had put their operations under scrutiny. The people responsible for Mako had abandoned it at the Northgate facility rather than risk having it discovered in their inventory. They had left it with no food, no water, and no shelter beyond what the building's damaged roof still provided, in the path of an incoming storm. Duncan sat with all of that for a while after Elise stopped speaking. He said finally that he had spent 3 years assuming the Navy's conclusion was wrong, but never knowing what the right answer was. He had built the search around the idea that Mako had survived and been taken somewhere, but the specific shape of it, the contractors, the refusals, the waiting, he had not let himself imagine that in any detail, because imagining it required confronting what the dog had been through in order to still be alive. Elise said she thought he should know that not one of the contractors' reports described Mako as broken or deteriorated. Difficult, dangerous, unmanageable, those were the words they used. The behavioral profile she was looking at read like a dog that had decided at a fundamental level that its mission wasn't over. It had just been waiting in the only way it knew how. Duncan looked at the door to the surgical suite at the end of the hallway and didn't answer. Dr. Holt came out 3 hours and 40 minutes after they had taken Mako in. She was still in her surgical scrubs, and she pulled her mask down before she spoke, which Duncan had been told was a good sign by a nurse who had noticed him watching the door. She said the fragment had been removed successfully. The arterial repair was clean. The infection site had been debrided, and the surrounding tissue looked better than she had expected once they were inside. Mako's heart rate had stabilized on the table in the final hour of the procedure, and its pressure had held. The next 24 hours would be the true indicator, but she was cautiously optimistic. Duncan thanked her in the way people thank someone when they don't have the right words and know it. They led him into the recovery room 30 minutes later. Mako was on a low platform bed, still under the effects of the anesthesia, breathing slow and even under a thermal blanket. Duncan sat on the floor beside the platform, not on the chair they had placed there, but on the floor at the dog's level, and set the old leash on the edge of the bed where Mako would be able to see it when it woke. When the dog finally opened its eyes, the first thing it did was find Duncan's face. It tried to raise its head and couldn't manage it. Duncan put a hand on its shoulder and told it to stay down, and Mako's head settled back onto the bed with the ease of an animal that had just received the one instruction it was most prepared to follow. For the first time since Ray Morrow had found it in the Northgate shipyard, the dog closed its eyes without orienting itself toward the door. Duncan stayed on the floor beside it and did not leave. In the weeks that followed, there were papers to sign and processes to complete. Elise handled the formal transfer of custody through the appropriate military channels, and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service opened a case file on Stonewake Maritime Security based on the documentation she had compiled. Leah Sutter called Duncan to apologize, and he told her, without any sharpness in it, that he didn't hold the decision against her or her staff. With the information they'd had, the call they made had been reasonable. It was the information that had been wrong. Leah said she had been thinking about that, about the difference between the question they had asked and the question they should have asked. They had spent 4 days asking how dangerous the dog was. It had not occurred to anyone to ask what had made it that way. Duncan said he thought that was probably true of more situations than just this one, and she agreed. Ray Morrow came to see Mako 6 weeks after the surgery, during one of Duncan's visits to Tidewater, to help with the new behavioral program Leah had established for traumatized working dogs. He stood at the doorway of the room where Mako was resting and didn't come in. He didn't announce himself or ask for permission. He simply lowered himself to the floor right there in the doorway, turned his body slightly sideways so he wasn't facing the dog directly, and sat. Mako looked at him from across the room. It didn't stand. It didn't make a sound. It watched him the way it watched most things now, with attention, but without the locked-on vigilance that had defined every moment of its time in the shelter. Ray sat with his back against the doorframe and looked at the wall across from him, and let the minutes go by. 15 minutes and Mako got up from its resting spot and walked across the room. It sat down next to Ray, close enough that their edges were nearly touching, and Ray kept looking at the wall. After another minute, he set his right hand flat on the floor between them, palm up, without making any move toward the dog. Mako lowered its muzzle into his open hand. Ray didn't move. He let out a long breath through his nose and held the stillness like something fragile he was trying not to disturb. Duncan was standing in the hallway and saw it happen through the interior window. He had learned over the course of his years working with Mako that the dog was a precise reader of character, not personality. Not charm, but something quieter and more reliable than either. He turned away from the window and left them to it. 6 months after the surgery, on a morning in late autumn, when the sky off the Virginia coast was pale and wide, and the tide was pulling back from the shore in long, flat sheets, Duncan and Mako walked the beach at first light. Mako was heavier now, its gait even and strong, its coat clean and full, in a way that made it look like a different animal than the one Ray had found in the Northgate shipyard. It still startled at certain sounds, the clang of metal, low mechanical vibrations, and it did not warm to strangers quickly. Duncan still had mornings where the vertigo hit before his feet touched the floor, and nights where the mission played back in his sleep with the particular fidelity that bad memories seem to reserve for the hours when there's nothing to distract from them. But there was a difference between then and now that wasn't easy to articulate, because it didn't live in any single thing. It lived in the fact that neither of them was carrying it alone anymore. Duncan's glove came off in a gust and hit the wet sand several paces behind him. He kept walking. Mako doubled back, picked it up with a clean, familiar grip, and trotted forward to press it into Duncan's hand. The same motion, the same sureness, unchanged by everything that had happened between the last time and this one. Duncan took the glove and looked at the dog beside him for a moment. Then he said it the same word, the one that had started as a command and become something else entirely over the course of 3 years and 4 days and 1 hallway in Chesapeake, Virginia. Anchor. Mako fell into step beside him, shoulder level with his knee, and they walked on together into the morning light. Not toward anything in particular, and not away from anything either. Just forward and together, which turned out to be enough. What stayed with me about this story isn't the moment Duncan said, anchor. It's everything that had to happen before that word could mean anything. The 4 years of trust built one mission at a time, and the 3 years Mako spent refusing to let go of it. We spend a lot of time asking whether something is dangerous. We don't always stop to ask what made it that way. Mako wasn't vicious. It was loyal in the only language it had left. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you've ever felt like the ones we write off too quickly might just be waiting for someone who speaks their language, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are more people, more animals, and more moments worth slowing down for. We'll see you in the next one.